If you've not played Diplomacy is Not an Option, I can guarantee one thing. It is going to surprise you. As I played the campaign and a bit of the challenge modes, I was constantly surprised. I came in expecting a fairly simple RTS/tower defense game that mostly existed to show off the crazy physics and large-scale battles. It's quite literally been on my wish list for years, and that's exactly why. It looked like it would be fun to pummel large quantities of enemy troops with catapults and trebuchets, watching them go flying, and I thought it would be nice simple fun to just watch my troops chew through enemies while they helplessly assaulted my heavily fortified base. So all of those things 100% happen and are an absolute joy to watch, but there's nothing simple about this experience. This also is not a relaxing experience where you sit back and watch your troops slaughter all that oppose you. As you get further into this game, it gets intense, and you need to be managing all aspects of your base in order to make it through these missions. So let's talk about the different components of the game. First, let's talk about the base building. You will have to build your base up pretty much from scratch with every mission. You will start with a few citizens, which are essentially a resource. You can use those citizens to start building logging camps, for example, where you need 2 citizens to build a camp. You can create buildings to gather food, gather wood, gather stone, gather iron. You then use those materials to build new buildings and also to create more troops. Crucially, in order to train more troops, you need citizens. If you have 10 citizens at the start of a day, and you train 8 of them as crossbowmen, you now only have 2 citizens left to do something like build a logging camp. This shared resource leads to really interesting decision making, where you have to decide if you want to try to build up your army to attack or defend, or if you're going to try to get away with less while investing heavily in your economy. You can build houses and a few other buildings to increase the number of citizens that your base can have. More citizens then in turn lets you either invest more in your resource gathering, or you can train more troops. With all of that said, we should talk about how you use those troops. The first way is to go assault the enemy. You build up a mix of ranged and melee, maybe some siege weapons, and go start conquering the map, which can reward you with more resources, and also, depending on the mission, prevent your base from being assaulted by random groups of enemies. And then when we talk about the combat plays very similar to Age of Empires or really any RTS. You have all your control groups and hotkeys that you would expect, and the units work pretty much exactly the way you would expect, although differences between units here are very pronounced. As an example, the spearmen don't put out a lot of damage, but they are amazing at holding the line. They take absolutely no damage from normal ranged projectiles, this doesn't include siege weapons, and they are very, very durable. Archers and crossbowmen are fairly similar, and in most situations I found the crossbowmen to be the better choice, but archers do have an activatable ability that is very strong. They are also very cheap units. But combat overall is what you would expect. However, it is as polished as basically any other big budget RTS, or at least as big of budgets as RTSs get these days. Now we get to the tower defense part of combat. So every so many days, you are going to be hit by progressively harder waves of enemies, and you absolutely need to be prepared for them. You will want to build walls and towers. You will want to have all your troops back at the base before those enemies get there. You will want to make sure that whatever direction the wave is coming from is well protected, because if they make it through your wall, things start to get out of hand very quickly. Additionally, this game also has a full research tree where you spend resources to upgrade your troops and the base. There is a market where you can trade resources, which is critical on some maps. The market is also the only means that I ran into to get gold, which you need to build tier 3 buildings and units. You also have a spell system with a few different spells, including summoning Dark Knights to fight for you for a short time, a healing ability, and then a couple damage abilities that you control. I mostly use the Dark Knights, but all abilities have a place. One thing I have intentionally been skipping to this point is that you can pause and also speed up time. You will pause a lot. In fact, I would guess the majority of players spend most of their time paused. It's possible this is just me, but I doubt it. The game is not easy, which I'll spend time on shortly, and you frequently can't afford to lose time trying to build or rearrange your base. You also will likely want to use pause to micromanage your units. It can be the difference between being annihilated and coming out with every single troop alive. So that's already way more depth than most people would be expecting from this game. And that's before you consider how all of this actually comes together, where you're trying to decide if you go attack an enemy or you stay at the base. Do you build your economy or do you build troops? If you can't afford to wall off entirely yet, where do you start? How much micro do you do to save your troops? There's a constant back and forth between the systems in this game where you're trying to decide which thing to focus on. Where do you use your citizens? Where do you spend your time? Where do you send your troops? Where do you defend? And how much do you defend each point? Resources are scarce and you have to be very strategic, and the way it all comes together in this game is really fantastic. And I think that brings us nicely around to a major topic in the Steam reviews at least, which is the difficulty. This is a difficult game. I don't think anyone is going to tell you differently. I played on the normal/medium difficulty. I think it's called Challenge Accepted, except for one mission where I accidentally misclicked and without realizing it chose Ultra Hardcore. I was so far into the mission at that point that I decided to go ahead and force myself to play through it, but for the most part, I stuck to the Challenge Accepted difficulty. I will admit I did consider bumping it down to easy many times, although from what I read, it sounds like it's still pretty much the same, but I went ahead and stuck with the Challenge Accepted difficulty. So I'll say this on the difficulty. This is massively harder than, let's say, an Age of Empires 4 or a StarCraft 2 or anything similar that I played. Like, it's not even close. That said, I really enjoyed the challenge. I enjoyed having to pause and plan my next move. I enjoyed having to make the tough decisions on how to survive. I even enjoyed having to occasionally reload it from a save and try something slightly different. But I will say I'm a huge fan of games like XCOM, and typically play that on a harder difficulty, although not the hardest, and I can enjoy a brutal challenge in those games. So I really enjoyed this. However, this is 100% going to be a huge turnoff for some, and I can understand that as well. Which this does take me to another point. I have not finished the campaign yet. Typically, I would try to knock out the entire campaign before posting a video, but honestly, I've put about 30 hours into the 7 to 8 missions, and from what I read, it sounds like there's somewhere between 28 and 35. I couldn't get an exact number. I'm kind of basing it off of their 1.0 patch notes and then a couple articles. And I'm just not really in the place right now where I can put another 50 plus hours into the game right now, especially with the level of stress that it actually induces. And I'm not saying that that stress is a bad thing. I 1000% plan to finish this game, but I do want to take a break. Play something else for a bit that's a little more relaxing, and then keep coming back to this and occasionally playing a mission or two. So I can't speak to the quality of the campaign in the back half, but I can say what I've played so far is absolutely fantastic. The cutscenes are simple, but they're witty, they're written with a great sense of humor. The mission variety is actually very impressive while keeping the core tower defense conceit throughout. The campaign branches, with you making choices along the way, deciding which faction to align with, which will change up the missions you get. So I suspect a full playthrough isn't actually going to be 28 to 35 missions, but regardless, there is a tremendous amount of content here. I actually thought I was about to finish the game after a major boss battle, and was very surprised when it kept going, that was the point when I decided to look up how many missions there were. And at that point, an 8-mission campaign would have sounded fairly short, although I was spending 2 to 5 hours per mission, which really makes them go a long way. Your mileage may vary, you may not spend anywhere near that much time on a mission, you may spend more. It all depends on how much you pause, how much you micromanage, all of that stuff. But anyway, from a value standpoint, diplomacy is not an option is an extraordinary value proposition. In addition to the campaign already discussed, there is an endless mode with a variety of maps, there's a sandbox mode, there are challenge modes. This is an amazing package at a $30 price point, and it's currently on sale until the 18th for $19.49. This is a tremendous amount of game for that price. All of that said, I do want to cover a few negatives, although honestly they're more nitpicks than they are major issues. The first is a complaint I actually recently had for the original StarCraft. Every mission you start with basically nothing. Sometimes a few interesting troops, but otherwise no real buildings. This does make sense here because your layout and what you choose to focus on is very important, and you wouldn't really want that decided for you. But maybe give players a bigger chunk of resources, or a few houses, or a few more citizens to speed it along. Something to speed up the early game a bit, because while I can fast forward, I still have a ton of work that needs to go into building that initial base, building houses, building hospitals, building cemeteries. All of these things that I build every single time, I have to build all over again. Anything to speed that up in the later missions would really be fantastic. Another nitpick is that some of the missions start using siege weapons on towers regularly, and they seem to have a very long range, possibly longer than the player has. This doesn't provide much counterplay, and instead I just have to use my units to basically charge the towers and attempt to burst them down. But when I do that, that puts the units in range of several other siege towers. For me, this kind of starts to get a bit tedious, because I don't feel like I have an appropriate way to deal with them. Then again, as I was typing the script, I just started to wonder if mounted archers would be good here. See, this is actually the beauty of the game. There is always another angle. This entire complaint may actually be a case of I just haven't tried the right tactic yet. So, I think I might try some mounted archers and see if they can dodge the projectiles. Anyway, other than that, there isn't much else to complain about. I do think it may be wise to add an even easier difficulty for people, at least based on the Steam reviews, but it wasn't an issue for me personally. But I can think of a few people that I would like to recommend this game to that I currently can't, because they're not going to be able to play it at this difficulty. So, for anyone wanting a challenging RTS, this is an absolute must-play. If the difficulty sounds like it will be a problem, then honestly it probably will be, and you may want to skip it. And unfortunately, it's further than 2 hours in before you really start to see the difficulty on display. On the other hand, the other potential issue for people would be that you need to regularly pause and manage your units and your base. I know this will be an issue for some people. However, that is something that you'll see in the first 2 hours, and you can get a feel for if that's going to bother you enough, and if it is, then just refund it. But I think for most people that pause is actually going to feel like a relief. It's going to add the layer of strategy you need to really manage everything and manage your base and manage your troops. So I think for most people it's going to be a good thing, but I have no doubt the pause is going to be an issue for some. Overall though, this is a huge recommend for me. By far the most fun I've had with an RTS since Age of Empires 4. I really can't recommend it enough. If you get a chance to pick this up, I would definitely do so. With that, I'll go ahead and leave it there. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, maybe subscribe, maybe hit the like button. It really does help. And with that, I'll see you next time.